Frederick the Great never believed that power made a person stronger. He believed it made a person narrower, more constrained, more predictable, and this belief shaped how he ruled long before he fully understood what ruling actually meant. As a young man, he was physically weak by the standards of his time, short, fragile, often ill, mocked quietly by officers who valued brute strength above intellect. And this early awareness of his own vulnerability never left him. Instead, it transformed into an obsession with discipline, order, and structure as substitutes for physical dominance. Frederick suffered from chronic anxiety long before the term existed, manifested not in panic but in control. He needed routines, precise schedules, repeated habits, because unpredictability made him deeply uncomfortable, and war, despite its chaos, offered something predictable: clear objectives, clear enemies, clear consequences. He despised loud emotional displays, especially among men in positions of authority, believing that uncontrolled emotion was a form of weakness that spread quickly through institutions, which is why his court was noticeably colder, quieter, more restrained than most European courts of the time. Frederick wrote extensively, but unlike many rulers, he did not write to glorify himself. He wrote to argue with himself, letters filled with doubts, contradictions, internal debates. And many of these writings reveal a man constantly questioning whether his own decisions were justified. Even when those decisions succeeded, he distrusted enthusiasm, seeing it as temporary madness rather than motivation, and preferred obedience born from habit rather than belief, because belief could change, while habit was slow, heavy, and resistant to disruption. Despite his reputation as a military genius, Frederick did not enjoy war. He tolerated it, accepted it, prepared for it obsessively, but privately described it as exhausting, degrading, and mentally corrosive, a necessary evil rather than a noble pursuit. Frederick often isolated himself for long periods, not out of melancholy alone, but because solitude allowed him to think without performing, without being observed, without shaping his face or tone for others. And these periods of isolation were essential for his mental balance. He had a deep fear of humiliation, not public defeat, but personal humiliation. The idea of being ridiculed or dismissed as inadequate disturbed him far more than death itself. And this fear pushed him to over-prepare, overthink, and rarely act impulsively. Music was not a hobby for Frederick. It was regulation. He played the flute daily, not for pleasure, but for mental alignment. Repetition calming his thoughts, creating a private rhythm separate from the demands of command. And he refused to miss these sessions. Even during campaigns, Frederick believed that rulers should appear simpler than they truly were. Less emotional, less expressive, almost dull. Because mystery created space for interpretation, while transparency invited interference. He actively avoided close emotional bonds, not because he lacked feeling, but because attachment created leverage, and leverage could be used against him, consciously or unconsciously, by those closest to power. Frederick was deeply suspicious of praise, especially excessive praise, interpreting it as either manipulation or misunderstanding. And he preferred criticism, believing it contained more usable information. He rarely celebrated victories, considering celebration a dangerous illusion of finality, as if success meant stability, and stability was something he never fully trusted. Despite his intellectual admiration for Enlightenment ideals, Frederick strictly controlled their application, believing that abstract ideas were safe only in controlled environments, among educated elites, and dangerous when applied indiscriminately. He believed most people did not want freedom in the philosophical sense, but predictability, protection, and structure, and he governed accordingly, shaping systems that appeared rational while limiting spontaneous social movement. Frederick was acutely aware of how quickly loyalty could shift under pressure, which is why he constantly rotated positions, prevented individuals from becoming irreplaceable, and discouraged personal followings within the military. He hated waste, not only financial waste, but emotional waste, unnecessary conversations, excessive ceremony, prolonged debates, and this intolerance made him appear cold, though in reality it was exhaustion disguised as efficiency. Frederick slept poorly for much of his life, plagued by recurring thoughts, hypothetical scenarios, imagined failures, and often rose before dawn, using the early hours to think while the world was still silent. and unintrusive, he believed fear was inevitable in governance. But it needed to be quiet, consistent, and impersonal, not dramatic or theatrical. Because dramatic fear provoked resistance, while quiet fear produced compliance, Frederick was highly sensitive to shifts in tone among his officers. Noticing subtle changes in language, posture, and hesitation, and often acted on these observations long before problems became visible, he distrusted large crowds instinctively, viewing them as emotionally volatile organisms rather than rational collectives. Capable of rapid swings between loyalty and hostility, he preferred written communication over spoken instruction whenever possible, believing writing reduced ambiguity and limited emotional interpretation. Turning orders into objects rather than conversations, Frederick believed that rulers should outlast crises rather than solve them immediately, allowing tension to exhaust itself while maintaining firm boundaries. A strategy that often made him appear passive when he was in fact waiting. He was deeply aware of his own limitations and compensated not through denial but through systems, layers of regulation, strict hierarchy, and repetitive procedure. Frederick believed that power was not seized once, but constantly renegotiated through routine, expectation, and quiet enforcement. He rarely trusted instinct alone, but when instinct conflicted with advisors, he often chose instinct. Having learned that committees diluted responsibility while intuition preserved it, he accepted that some suffering was unavoidable in maintaining order, but viewed it as structural cost rather than moral failure, a mindset that allowed him to act decisively without emotional collapse. Frederick did not believe in legacy as immortality, but as residue, the unavoidable trace left behind by prolonged control, and he cared less about how he was remembered than about whether the system endured even at moments of apparent confidence. Frederick remained mentally defensive, always anticipating reversal, betrayal, or collapse, because in his mind stability was never permanent, only temporarily maintained. As Frederick grew older, he became less interested in conquest and more obsessed with maintenance, not expansion but preservation. Understanding that building power was dramatic while sustaining it was invisible, exhausting, and thankless, he increasingly distrusted optimism, seeing it as a sign of inexperience, and preferred advisors who anticipated failure rather than success. Believing pessimism produced preparation, while optimism produced complacency, Frederick gradually reduced his physical presence at court, appearing less often, speaking less, allowing silence to replace authority displays. Because he understood that absence could command more attention than constant visibility, he feared becoming predictable, not to enemies alone but to his own system, and deliberately changed routines just enough to disrupt expectation without creating chaos in private. Frederick often referred to himself as a servant of the state rather than its master, not out of humility but resignation. Believing that once power was assumed it could no longer be set down without collapse, he believed that rulers aged faster mentally than physically, worn down not by years, but by accumulated decisions, unresolved consequences, and moral compromises that could never be fully justified. Frederick became increasingly selective in conversation, cutting exchanges short, avoiding explanations, believing that excessive clarification weakened authority by suggesting uncertainty. He distrusted charisma, especially his own, and consciously avoided inspiring emotional devotion, preferring loyalty rooted in routine and institutional dependence rather than personal attachment. He developed a quiet contempt for theatrical leadership, public speeches, exaggerated gestures, symbolic displays, viewing them as distractions for those unwilling to manage complexity. Frederick rarely expressed anger openly, but when he did, it was calculated, controlled, and brief. Designed to reset boundaries rather than punish emotionally, he became increasingly aware that success isolated him, not failure, because success eliminated equals, leaving only subordinates and rivals, neither of whom could speak freely. Frederick believed that prolonged peace was more dangerous than war, because peace encouraged comfort, softness, and intellectual stagnation. While conflict kept systems alert and adaptive, he feared irrelevance more than defeat, the slow transition from decision maker to symbol, and resisted any attempt to reduce his role to ceremonial presence. Frederick rarely delegated fully, not out of mistrust alone, but because delegation fragmented responsibility, and fragmentation diluted accountability. He believed that systems failed not from rebellion, but from fatigue, slow erosion. Minor neglects accumulating until collapse appeared sudden, but was long prepared in later years. Frederick slept even less, plagued not by ambition but by retrospection, revisiting decisions not to regret them, but to understand their structural impact. He became increasingly aware that fear worked best when impersonal, embedded into procedure rather than delivered by individuals, making obedience feel automatic rather than coerced. Frederick disliked being loved by the public, seeing mass affection as unstable and unreliable. Capable of reversing without warning, he believed that intellectual superiority created distance, not connection, and accepted this isolation as unavoidable rather than tragic. Frederick avoided emotional closure, believing unresolved tension kept people attentive, cautious, and engaged. He believed power was most effective when it felt inevitable. When alternatives appeared unrealistic rather than forbidden, he became increasingly intolerant of inefficiency, seeing it as disrespect to structure itself. Not merely poor performance, Frederick saw history not as judgment, but as distortion, a selective compression of complexity into simplified narratives, and accepted that his own image would eventually be misinterpreted. He believed that rulers were remembered not for intentions, but for consequences. Regardless of internal reasoning, Frederick did not believe people changed fundamentally, only adjusted behavior under pressure, and governed accordingly. He feared emotional dependence on approval, training himself to operate without validation, praise, or reassurance. Frederick understood that control was not dominance, but anticipation. Acting before situations demanded visible force, he believed that order required constant renewal, daily reinforcement, subtle correction. Because decay was natural, while stability was artificial, he viewed rebellion not as moral failure, but as structural signal, evidence of misalignment rather than betrayal. Frederick became increasingly quiet toward the end of his life, not reflective, but vigilant. As if still guarding something fragile, he accepted loneliness as the cost of uninterrupted authority. Not as tragedy, but as transaction. He believed that power never rested. It only shifted pressure points, demanding continuous adjustment. Frederick ruled not because he enjoyed command, but because he feared disorder more than exhaustion, and in the end, Frederick the Great did not see himself as victorious or defeated, only unfinished, aware that control was never complete, stability never permanent, and authority never free from erosion. He understood that ruling was not about shaping people, but shaping systems that outlived intention, emotion, and memory, and that understanding, more than genius or force, was what allowed him to hold power for as long as he did.